That's the line.
Let me give you the email.
I gave him all along.
How long?
Yeah.
This is always the problem.
Whichever.
You can tell me.
I can send them tonight.
Yeah, we tell them to. So we don't get them.
We need them by tomorrow.
Like pictures?
You can come and take
No, is it ready to mic him up?
Yes.
Okay, let's go.
Do you want to do the miking up?
My media training.
Get the pictures
No, I don't
today.
know.
Because we're leaving very early tomorrow morning.
No, I think you prefer it coming from.
Yeah.
Oh, you from home? Oh, you from home? Oh, God bless you.
Oh, you thought we were here?
I thought people live in the States.
That's why we were shaking when you said that.
No.
If we are here,
You're coming out here, right?
That's usually here, right?
So it's up and then when we get in the room, we'll just put it on.
Yeah, good. So don't tell me.
Yes. No push moments here.
Should we go ahead? Are there seats reserved in front?
Part of the team that was in here.
In terms of what triggered the decision.
Oh, okay.
The team? No.
Yes, from the central bank.
But I'm going to go this way because that
Don't even, because then let's. Yeah, of course.
I'm going to take 2 pictures. 1, 2, 3. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then your team.
For your records,
I'm not taking any picture with you know, it's bad enough without the picture.
If only he knew what I just did for him.
Did you ask me for your BB?
Now look now.
I didn't understand.
All right.
Ready?
Yes. Ready? Ladies.
You're standing behind the lectern.
You're talking.
I'm going to go in first.
You know, she's a groupie for the governor.
So it's only side long. So maybe we should also do that with him too.
What's the audience like?
It's a mix. So there's students, there are professionals, there are professors, there are Africans, there are non-Africans. New York City, so diversity comes with the program. It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
Good to see you. I couldn't let somebody get away with that. My apologies for those technical issues. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Columbia Business School and to the 9th Annual African Economic Forum. It's a great honour this evening for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Nigerian Central Bank Governor MOV006. Governor Sanusi Governor Sanusi and I first met in Lagos, where I was reporting for Reuters news agency 3 years ago. And I must take this opportunity to thank him for his transparency at the head of the central bank. Whenever we were struggling in the newsroom to understand the latest developments in the Nigerian economy, his commentary and explanation were always just a phone call or sometimes a text message away. And I must say it's a privilege I wish I still enjoyed as a student of economics here now at Columbia, to be able to send the governor an SMS and ask which way I should move the LM curve would be a great benefit indeed. Governor Sanusi has a long and distinguished career in economics and finance. After starting out teaching economics at Ahmadu Bello University in Nigeria, he went on to hold senior positions with the country's leading banks, rising to be chief executive of First Bank, the country's largest lender. But it was shortly after his appointment as central bank governor in June 2009 that he really shot to international recognition. Just months into his term of office, he launched a $4 billion bailout of 9 Nigerian lenders and fired the management of 8 of them for malpractice and corruption. And to think that this was simply the local manifestation of what was happening elsewhere in the world during the global financial crisis would be to underestimate the Nigerian context. The Sanusi tsunami, as it quickly became known, was an unprecedented challenge to powerful vested interests whose abuse of office, corruption and impunity had held Nigeria back for so long. His actions won him enemies at home. Asked in the days after the bailout what his greatest challenge was, he quipped, "Staying alive." I was only half joking. But his actions also won him international recognition and cast Nigeria in a new light in the eyes of investors. Banker magazine, published by the Financial Times, named him Global Central Bank Governor of the Year. Time magazine last year listed him among the world's 100 most influential people of 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, what better speaker to begin this 9th African Economic Forum? We're extremely grateful for Governor Sanusi taking time out from his engagements in Washington to travel to New York for this event. It's a privilege and an honor to ask you to put your hands together again for Nigerian Central Bank Governor MOV006.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good evening, everyone. I suppose Nick's opening remarks about me speaking to the press are sufficient to tell you that I get myself into trouble a lot. Central bank governors should not be speaking so freely to journalists, and I seem to do more of that than I should. Always getting in trouble back home. I've been asked to speak about unlocking Africa's potentials, lessons from Nigeria. And I'll try not to dwell too much on the banking crisis, which is a topic that we talked about often, unless Q&A. Oh. Okay. Okay, can you hear me? I had this off because I didn't want to have a boarded round. All right, so one of the best ways to look at Africa, I think, is to look at Nigeria, which is the second largest economy. And this is a country where I know, as a country where we've been talking about potentials for decades. And it's a country that every time seems to be on the cusp of something great. And the problems that we have are problems that are similar to many African countries, and I must say they are being addressed in a number of African countries. We must remember that Africa is not one country, it's 52 different countries. A lot is happening in countries like Ethiopia, countries like Botswana, countries like Angola, Mozambique, the infrastructure corridor in Tanzania, the breadbasket programs in Ghana. So the difference with Africa today compared to 20, 30 years ago is that whereas 20, 30 years ago you point to South Africa and no other country, today you have a number of African countries that seem to be getting it right. The growth rates in Ethiopia have been remarkable, even though inflation is a big problem. But what the government has done with coffee, what it's doing with electricity, it's amazing for a country that has come out really of the war. So what are the major issues and what do I see as a problem? When people ask me, what is the problem facing the Nigerian economy, how would you sum it up? If you were to sum it up in one word, in one phrase, what would you say? I say value chain. Externalities. Nigeria is a country that is the world's 7th largest producer of crude oil. Yet the biggest export of the United Kingdom to Nigeria is petroleum products. We have a large cotton belt. We import our textiles and fabric from China. We're the world's #1 producer of cassava. We don't produce starch or ethanol. We have a large tomato belt. We are the world's largest importer of tomato paste. We import it from China. What we don't get from China, we get from Italy, from a company called Chinese. So we burn our gas, flare everything, and we generate only 4,800 megawatts of electricity. And in all of this, the country has grown at a rate of 7% on average every year for the last 10 years. So the question is, at what rate will Nigeria grow if it only fixed this value chain? And this problem is the same problem with most African countries. Economies driven by the reliance on the primary sectors, maybe the tertiary sector, very little emphasis on the secondary sector. And that is where we have poverty and inflation. The result of the structure and the structural deformities of the economy is that you have a country that's an oil-producing country, the 2nd largest economy in Africa, but 90% of the population is on less than $2 a day. Because the oil industry is not employment intensive. The telecoms industry, which pays well, is not employment intensive. And all the employment is in agriculture. And agriculture is very low value added. It does not create income, and look at the distribution of poverty by occupation of family head. 80% of the poor come from farming families. Now, for me, the secret to unlocking Africa lies in moving Africa from primary sectors to the secondary sectors. And I will take Nigeria again as an example and go through these areas. Now take agriculture. My favorite example, and I'm sure those who've listened to me so many times are getting very bored with this, is tomato. Okay, where we produce, I think 40–50% of the tomato that's produced in Nigeria every year is lost between the farm and the market. And this is just one product. It happens with grains. We move cattle from the north to the south. We don't move beef, we don't move dairy, we move cattle. Okay. You've got, like I said, cassava, and you transport cassava hundreds of kilometers from the farms to the starch factories. And you know what you're supposed to transport? You're transporting water. These are all production inefficiencies. Agriculture is 42% of Nigeria's GDP. It gets only 1% of land lending. It's moved to 3% now. We're trying to move it to 7%. Now, power is another. You've got gas in the Niger Delta. We sell gas to France. We sell gas to Italy. We sell gas in the United States, yet we don't have gas going from southern Nigeria to the north or to the west. Now, the solution to Nigeria's economic problems with a market of 167 million people is very simple economics. Produce what you can produce and import what you can't produce. You look at our import bill, we spent $1.5 billion last year importing wheat from the United States. Spent over $1 billion importing rice from Thailand and India, most of it 5-year-old rice from grain reserves. Now we should be importing aircraft, we should be importing rockets, we should be importing computers, we shouldn't be importing rice. We should be importing tomato paste, we should be importing textiles. And what Africa needs to do is rethink its relationship with China. Great country, emerging market economy, second biggest economy in the world, but Africa should be the competition for China. Africa today is where China was 30, 40 years ago. Labor in Africa is now cheaper than it was in China. China has lost that competitive advantage in the world. The only thing Africa lacks is first-class infrastructure and technical and vocational training. If we got infrastructure, if we got training, we would first of all take the African market away from China. Before we start competing with the Chinese to sell textiles to the Americans and to the British, we can at least sell textiles to Africans. Textiles produced in Africa. Goods produced in African countries for the African market. And the only way to do this is to think of a clear policy framework that attracts the right type of investment. So we don't just have foreign investment coming to the equities market or coming to the fixed income market, because what happens is it goes into government bonds, and government bonds then go into the government project, and 70 or 80% of government budget is really with current estate and overheads. So we're really getting foreign investment into Africa to finance salaries and overheads, rather than financing infrastructure. We have a big problem with intermediation domestically. My country has about 2.6 trillion naira in pension funds. Not a single naira of that money is invested in infrastructure. All of it is in government bonds, it's in treasuries, central bank bills, and maybe equity. How do we improve intermediation capacity and build the roads and the rail networks and the power plants that we have? Now, the last financial crisis, and today I was giving an interview, and I was asked about my concerns about Nigeria. And the concerns really are that we have an economy in which oil is only 13% of GDP, but oil plays a disproportionate role in macroeconomic stability. Ordinarily, the central bank government should be concerned if the price of oil were to go up or down, if it's only 13% of GDP. But if that commodity accounts for 80% of government revenue, if that commodity accounts for 98% of export earnings, then 13% of GDP is not the issue. It is that anything that happens to the price of oil has impact on the exchange rate, it has impact on my reserves, it has impact on the government fiscal position. And that tells you the fundamental problem that other countries face by not having a proper structural adjustment. In the 1980s, most of us accepted the IMF World Bank guidelines of investment. There was progress on macroeconomic stability, on control of inflation, but we also had a period of deindustrialization. Signed up to free trade agreements that expose our markets to competition. It's a level playing field. The example I give always is a football match between the Nigerian under-16 team and the English national team. Playing field is level. The rules are the same, but the winner is known. The British protected their industries until Britain became the leading industrial power in the world. And then Britain preached free trade. And when Britain started preaching free trade, the Germans, if you look at Frederick List, for those people who develop theory, and the Americans refused to accept free trade because they knew that they could not compete with British costs. Until the Americans and the Germans got to the level where they could compete, then they started preaching free trade. Every country, China preaches free trade. Every country preaches free trade when it's going to compete. The problem is that African countries accepted free trade before they were ready for competition. And imported goods have wiped out our industries. We are a large market. Nigeria alone has a population of 167 million people. One of the reasons Dangote is the richest African is because he has the largest market for building materials, for food, fast-moving consumer goods. Anyone who invests in that market, okay, does have demand. The challenge is, how do you get that production? I have nothing against American goods. I have nothing against British or Chinese or Indian goods. What we need to do is to get the Americans and the Chinese and the Indians to come and produce on African soil, employ African workers, create income on Africa, and export from African soil to the rich rather than deplete limited reserves for African nations. So the greatest challenge we have faced in our country in the last 2 years is, how do you move forward the structural adjustment? And obviously, there will have to be some difficulties. We have created a rentier economy, and many African countries have created that because we're resource rich. Economies in which people find it easier to make money by manipulating the political and legal process than by actually involving themselves in real production. So we subsidize petroleum products. And we don't build our refineries. And my country spent over 2 trillion naira last year subsidizing fuel vehicles. Okay? Now just think of it this way. We sold about $9 billion to petroleum importers. That was 4% of our GDP. Paid another $9 billion as subsidy, another 4% of GDP. And that subsidy is a hedge. Effectively, what Nigerian oil marketers do is import and subsidize the rest of West Africa. A major trade. Now, why can't we have refineries? Because you've got a number of people that make a lot of money selling petroleum products in Nigeria. We don't have power because Nigeria is the biggest importer of generators in the world. A lot of people make a lot of money selling generators to Nigeria, selling diesel to Nigeria, and therefore there are vested interests in these reforms that will move the power forward. A lot of people make a lot of money selling rice to Nigeria, and Americans make a lot of money selling meat to Nigeria. The Americans don't want you to produce your meat because we spent $1.5 billion importing meat, probably our biggest market for American meat. Now it's time for Africa to start thinking, how do we get the Americans to stop selling goods to us and sell agricultural equipment and machinery and technology and come and produce meat in Africa? Okay? How do we change the nature of the relationship with these countries? Now, China is another example. We never think of China as a colonial power because there's never any pure power in Africa. But what do the Chinese do in Africa? They come for the oil, they come for the solid minerals, and they sell finished products. Now, what is colonialism? what was colonialism? It's about access to raw materials and markets for finished goods. So, but no one thinks of China as an imperial power. Perishly thought. Not China. But that is the nature of the economic relationship. And no country in the history of the world has ever developed from exporting primary products. Terms of trade shift against you. You don't have technology, you don't have economies of scale. You don't create jobs that generate it. And so that is the broad canvas in my mind to what African countries need to do. Now, what we have tried to do in Nigeria is to start a petroleum industry process where we try to get investments into petrochemicals, into refineries, that process cannot move forward until you remove fuel subsidies. There's a lot of resistance to that. The general public doesn't want it. You've got political issues. But the reality is African countries have to face difficult political decisions. And I'm sure many Nigerians here would not agree with me there, but it's like when you occupy Nigeria. And, the last time a government official came to New York, I think he had a very rough year. Okay, but the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that you cannot continue to subsidize consumption, to subsidize living. You have nothing against subsidies, but we have to subsidize production. We have to subsidize refineries and stop subsidizing the import of petroleum products. We have to subsidize agricultural production and stop subsidizing imports of fertilizers. And this is the central message that African countries need to have. Now, a country like Ethiopia, and I would like to use Ethiopia as an example. Today, if you go to any Starbucks shop, the coffee you drink was made in Ethiopia. It took 3 years working with the IFC for Ethiopian coffee farmers to produce coffee to the standard that was required by Starbucks. And farmers that used to get less than 20% of the value of the end product started getting 80–90% of that. Now that's an example of how you face Africa's problems. Today in Tanzania, the government is building an infrastructure corridor that goes through 40% of the arable land of the country. Rail lines straight from the ports to the border with the DRC. Land being available. I was at the World Economic Forum meeting in Addis Ababa. The president said, if I build this rail line, if I provide electricity, how many people are willing to invest in Tanzania? We had 50 multinationals immediately say will come. Okay. Now that is how you create an environment for investment. Africa needs to face infrastructure. I get asked the question, how would you turn Africa into China? And I close my eyes and say, can you imagine gas pipelines from Algeria across North Africa, from the Niger Delta across West Africa, from Angola and Mozambique to Eastern and Southern Africa? That is enough to light up the whole of Africa. You get power, you get industries. You get industries, you get jobs. You get jobs, you get income, you get domestic demand. And that is enough to take African countries out of poverty. The short and medium-term strategy for Africa has to be not to compete with the Chinese in getting to American markets, but to compete with foreigners in accessing African markets. It has to be an import substitution strategy. And it might require a review of trade policies, because we do have unfair trade practices. We're told free trade is good. I don't know how many people are from Mali. Any Malians here? The two major products for Mali are cattle, beef, and cotton. Now, the amount of subsidy that the United States gives cotton farmers exceeds the entire GDP of Mali. The subsidy for a cow in Europe is 300 euro, and that is more than the per capita income of Mali. How does Mali compete internationally with the Americans or Europeans? How does that feel to become a level playing field? So looking at these trade wars, demanding changes, and I said at the OECD meeting in Paris last year, that when we go for trade meetings, the Chinese look at the document and say, what is good for China? The Indians look at it and say, what is good for India? The Africans look at it and say, what is good for Europe? What do we have as a result? Now 60% of Africans are foolish.
70% of the world population has no access to road. 40% of us have no access to safe water. And you can't get this without growing an economy, and you can't grow an economy without building manufacturing. It's now a common theme in development. We can no longer listen to what theory tells us we should do. We should look at how those countries that develop actually develop. And so the central message, and like I said, it's very simple. It's about value chains. Imagine what would happen in Nigeria if we stopped throwing away that tomato. If we basically kept it, reduced the waste, and processed and stopped importing. Imagine the jobs that we created when you build rice processing plants and stop importing rice. When you move from cassava to starch, to cassava flour, to chips, to ethanol. When you move from crude oil to refined petroleum products, to petrochemicals, and start exporting to West Africa. When you move from gas flaring to producing your own power. When you move away from exporting cotton to producing textiles and fabric, at every single point in the value chain, you create jobs. When you create jobs, you create income. When you create income, you create demand. When you create demand, the economy grows. It's a very simple model. It's the model that everybody went through as well that we want to go through. So the real challenge for all of us in Africa is to say, how do you create that model? How do you build the infrastructure? How do you provide a technical and vocational education? How do you build institutions, institutional framework? And that, of course, means transparency. It means the fight against corruption. It means having clear signals that there are lines that cannot be crossed. What we did in banking and the arrest of the CEOs, we jailed the CEOs. It was a simple example for NC. The banks themselves were being insolvent. We did have a crisis. And that crisis was partly a result of the second round phase of the global crisis. Oil price crashed. As a result of that, the people out of the system, the capital market collapsed, and banks that had exposure to the capital market had their capital wiped out. So there was a certain level at which this crisis was like a global crisis. But there was a more fundamental level, which was just fraud. And we discovered after taking over the banks that in some cases, and in many cases, the lenders and the borrowers were one and the same. That people set up SPVs, lent money to themselves. The money didn't really go to the capital market, or if it went to the capital market, it was just transit. We traced property to United Arab Emirates. We traced property to the Potomac. Yes, we recovered assets in Washington. Okay? We traced property to South Africa. We had a bank CEO that basically on her own, just her and her family, had taken away $2 billion from the bank. We recovered 200 pieces of real estate in Dubai. In addition to property in South Africa, property in the United States. We would never have known this if we had not taken over banks, because everything had been structured as loans to companies that were supposed to have been used in the capital market, and there was a perfect excuse. The market had crashed by 70%, that was where the money had gone. Now, rent seeking is a feature that continues to destroy Africa. It destroys the financial system, it destroys the real economy. The financial system needs to get away from being a source of rent for management. It has to get away from being a source of mobilizing savings for speculation in the capital market to being a real intermediary into the real economy. And part of what we've done in Nigeria is to engage with the government to try and fix agriculture so that banks can lend to agriculture, to try and fix power so that banks can lend to power, to try and fix infrastructure so that pension money can go into infrastructure. Until we do that, domestic savings that we have will not be used to finance development. And we need to encourage domestic savings, and we need to channel these savings into development. The final 2 points I'd like to mention, and I think I'll then leave the floor open to questions and answer the specific issues you'd like me to address. I can see my deputy governor smiling because she knows what is coming. There's the importance of women in Africa. I'm very passionate about African women. I'm not in a literal sense. But I'm a very strong believer in the principle that we can never address poverty in Africa without addressing the issue of women. And this is about their access to finance. It's about financial inclusion. Now, what we've done in Nigeria, I'll give you a few examples. We've tried to look at the reasons behind women not getting finance. And a key reason is that we don't have enough women in senior positions in the banking industry. Most of the deals in banks are done by, it's not what taking. Most of the deals in banks are done by men who meet in clubs, go to the golf club, go to the polo club, over drinks. Most women don't go to those places. You're not likely to meet a bank managing director at a wedding or at a naming ceremony or a party. And the reason is that we simply don't have enough of them. We look at the statistics in the banking industry. At the junior level, there's no problem. You've got young ladies getting into banking. As soon as they get to middle management, they take off. One of the things we've done is to declare this year the year for women economic empowerment. And we got all the bank CEOs in Nigeria to sign up to a commitment. Between now and 2014, we're going to increase the percentage of women in top management in banking to 40%. We're going to have a minimum of 30% of board seats in every bank given to women. Now, we've tried to do that in the central bank as well. And when you look at statistics, you know, statistics can be horrible when you actually see them. Between 1959 and 2009, 50 years of the history of the central bank, only 4 women rose to be directors in the bank. This is one of them. Now, this is an institution that has had staff strength of 10,000. So of the thousands of staff that have gone through the bank in 50 years, only 4 women. In the last 2.5 years, we have appointed 7. We hope by 2014 that 50% of the directors of the central bank will be women. Now, why is that important? In the formulation of policy, when men sit down and formulate policy, they don't think about women. They don't. It's not deliberate. They're just not women. And the women issues do not rank high in their radar. You do a financial inclusion strategy, you talk about the poor, you talk about what you call the bottom of the pyramid. As I said in Davos, the bottom of the pyramid in Africa is the African man, okay? But the woman is actually below the pyramid. Okay, so you actually have to dig. If you really want to get women, you have to dig below the pyramid, you know? And that is, and you need the woman to say, hey, you know, we're right below there, because under the feet of every poor African man, there's an even poorer African woman. That is not seen. And it is those women that you need to bring out. And when you address their problem, you address the problem of poverty. And one of the ways to do it is to make sure that you have women in positions where policy is made, where lending policy is made, when products are being developed. Now, by consciously addressing that, we in the central bank have seen how gender blind we have been. We've had series of funds in the history of the central bank for agriculture, for SMEs. Never have we had anything targeted at women until this year, when we're setting up a fund that will allow all businesses owned and managed by women to access single-digit interest rate loans. Okay? Now, it's a big step because it is one of the greatest signals to the industry that women and women businesses have to be given priority. The final thing I'd like to talk about is the structure of the banking industry itself. The history of banking, and I see it today, I think Zambia has just announced an increase in capital requirements for banks by 1,000%. Many African countries have gone through this path of consolidation. Nigeria went through this path of banking consolidation. Before 2008, it was the same story. We need to have big banks. We need to have banks like Standard Bank, we have to have banks like Nedbank. And it has become the pattern across Africa. Every central bank wants to have large banks. Personally, I disagree. I have nothing against big banks. But we have created a very dangerous situation where we have a banking system that's made up of very big banks and microfinance institutions. That middle, where you need small and medium enterprises, is totally unbanked. The big banks go to the large oil companies, they go to the large telecoms companies, they go to the large multinational corporations, and they have no time for SMEs. The microfinance banks are too small to finance small factories, cottage industries, the middle market. And the middle market is where 70% of our jobs are created. The middle market is what should be contributing 70% of GDP. The middle market is what should be contributing to export earnings. So part of what we're trying to do, and what we broke up the universal model, banking model in Nigeria, we introduced what we call levels of authorization. Now I know I have been criticized a lot for this, okay? But I continue to explain the logic behind it. We say international banks have capital of 50 billion. National banks remain 25, and we created what are called regional banks, or provided guidelines for them with a lower capital requirement of 10 billion. And we are actively trying to promote those small, medium banks who are not going to be lending to Shell and Mobil and Chevron and MTN, but who will finance small textile companies, who will finance cocoa processing plants, who will finance cassava plants, who will finance agribusinesses, who will finance fertilizer dealers, who will provide the finance across the country in different parts and different industries that will create jobs and create income and help with this transformation from primary to the secondary sector. So there is a whole paper here. I usually never read papers, and I'm sure you'll get a soft copy of this later. I'd like to stop here. I'd like to take questions and then address specific areas that the audience would like to message in. Thank you.
Okay, can I invite questions from the floor? Yeah, the gentleman at the back.
Governor Sanusi, thank you so much for addressing us. I just want to mention very quickly, huge admirer, heard you speak many times, and you're a big fan of many of us, and I think you are a national hero of Nigerian as well. My question speaks to how you address some of the issues which I think many of us are in agreement with, particularly in terms of rent seeking, both domestically and externally. And the specific question is, being Nigerian myself and understanding the landscape somewhat, the reality seems to me that you have to find some way to incentivize some of those domestic rent seekers to be a part of a constructive solution. And you may disagree, but I'm just curious to your thoughts on how you incentivize some of the people who are, well placed in the economy and have a lot of influence to sort of subscribe to your notions of how you move things forward. And number two is about external rent seeking. And I'm very curious to understand the leverage you bring to the table when negotiating some of these international imbalanced trade policies. For instance, how do you get these guys to come and invest in domestic soil and so on, and the subsidy issues and so on. Thank you very much.
Could you take three questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question has to do with the arrival of satellite internet you were launching last year of the satellite, and also with the arrival of the ACE cable in October. What is that going to mean financially? How are you going to harness that? We are indirectly involved in this area. Thank you.
And the third question from the back.
Hi, my name is Ashley Bendel. I work for Renaissance Capital here in the United States. I represent their African business, and it's a pleasure to see you and your colleagues from the Stock Exchange here. What are you doing? You're obviously through the States and you're through DC. What are you doing to encourage institutional investment from foreigners? Clearly they make up a huge proportion of the daily trading volumes at the moment. I'd love to hear what efforts are being made by the SEC, who are obviously making a lot of progress with regards to interacting to perhaps US investors specifically, because I know that a lot of them would love to interact with you and your colleagues whilst you're through the country quite regularly. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start from the last one. It's the easiest, actually. We actually do a lot of roadshows, and forgive my rudeness, I must recognize Aaron Moshe, the Director General, Securities and Exchange Commission. And Aruma has been a big partner in all this reform battle. As you know, when we started with the banks, it became very clear very early on that everything we did with the banking industry would come to nothing if the capital market itself was not reformed. And when Aruma joined as CEO of SEC from African Development Bank, she took on that gauntlet. I think she's got about 160 people before the Investment and Securities Tribunal. She started going through her own battles, and I think right now she's in the middle of one big one with the National Assembly. But that is what happens. But what we've done with this is she's removed the DG of the Stock Exchange herself, appointed a new management. There is a greater emphasis on disclosure and transparency. And we're dealing for the first time with many issues that bedevil capital markets in developing nations, insider-related transactions, securities fraud, manipulation of stock prices. And I think for the first time we've seen a whole raft of very senior people being brought before tribunal and being charged with capital market malpractice. The real issue for investors in Nigeria is this issue of transparency. I mean, I think that the Nigerian story is a good one. People, it's an oil-producing country, 167 million people. Look at how much money the telecoms companies have made, for example. Now, that is nothing compared to what you make in power if you have cost-reflective tariffs. Okay, you've got gas, you've got oil, you've got agriculture, you've got a market, but people are worried about transparency. People are worried about compliance with the rules. People are worried about things like money laundering, and the work that she's done in the stock exchange has been the major change. And I think when you go around, and I'm sure you talk to investors, you do get that response and that reaction that, look, for the first time, we believe in the numbers we see. Now, on the first question on rent seeking, it's a very dangerous game to try to engage people co-profit so much from rent because, as they say, you never invite turtles to Christmas dinner. Okay? They don't usually turn up. Or they turn up on the plate or something. I mean, people, the reason we don't make progress is because these guys simply don't know any other way to make money apart from stealing. And that's the word. Stealing. And you need to get people who are able to take the risk of moving, as they say, from primitive accumulation to real investment. Actually taking this money and turning it into capital. Now, a few people have done it. A few people have invested. I mean, I keep giving the example of Aliko Dangote. If every Nigerian businessman just looked at how much money you can make by risking capital and going into an industry where you've got strong demand, and make much more money year on year. I mean, Obajana factory, I'll give you an example of Obajana. That factory today produces 600 bags of cement a minute. That's ₦1 million a minute, every single day. And 97% of the raw materials are found on site. And there is enough reserve of raw materials to last 250 years. And it's going to be doubled to be the largest cement factory in the world. Now, how many oil wells give you that kind of money? But people are so comfortable, bringing in generators and making a 10% profit, importing fuel and getting a subsidy, and smuggling it across to Niger and to Republic of Benin. And then when the government leaves and they don't have political connections, after 5 years they broke. Okay, and you have a new set of rent seekers depending on who is in power. Now, it's a combination of providing incentives for this money to go into investment, but you do have to confront them and expose them. I mean, there are times when you've got to say, it is not about negotiating with these people, it's about getting them out of our lives. I'm blocking the opportunities for rent seeking. There's no point trying to convince someone to take money from petroleum subsidy and invest in refineries. Stop paying the subsidy. Just stop paying it. You just close off the opportunities for rent seeking. There is no point, trying to get people to stop importing generators. One of the problems we have today is on tariffs on power. Nigerians are saying you can't increase tariffs, The government wants a tariff of 22 naira, already in the press. There's a lot of noise. Yeah? How much are you paying today for darkness? The cost of darkness is infinity. You can't even earn anything. Now you're being offered electricity, at half the price of self-generated electricity, because if you have your generator, you're spending 45 naira per kilowatt hour. You're being offered electricity at 22 naira. And if you do provide power, you can go to a village and be a mechanic, you can be a hairdresser, You can set up a small cottage factory. You can begin to earn income and pay. And you read the press every day. You would think that Nigeria was a country where everybody had 24%, 24/7 power supply, and all of a sudden we're increasing the tariffs. There is no way you're going to get investments into gas. I mean, look at the oil companies. It's cheaper for an oil company to flare the gas than to invest in a pipeline. And you can't get Shell or Mobil to invest in pipelines if you're not going to pay them a good price for their gas. It's simple economics. So we need to get the power out. And part of the problem is the way we communicate the economics of it. That at very low levels of income, the ability to earn a living more than compensates for the cost you pay for electricity. And people need to understand that. But people who claim to be acting on behalf of the poor claim that it is inhuman to ask them to pay 22 naira per kilowatt hour. Meanwhile, it is not inhuman to use their foreign exchange to import generators and to leave those who cannot afford generators in darkness. You know, and this is the kind of communication war that needs to be done. So there are, I think, people who would invest if they had the opportunity. There are people who would spend all their money and all their resources to stop reform, because reform cuts off the opportunities that they have. Now, these are not necessarily all Nigerians. You do have foreigners, okay, who benefit from it. I'm sure many of the companies that produce and export generators will be very sad to see that market disappear. But we need to tell those countries, instead of making money from selling generators to us, why don't you come and set up power plants and repatriate your dividends? The South Africans are making a lot of money from MTN on dividends. You know, and you know, a lot of that, which links me up to your point. We've got the cables in Nigeria, and again, I'm sure a few Bismarck here can confirm this. When I spoke to telecoms companies, they'll tell you that it costs them less to get the cable from Portugal to Lagos than it's costing them to build cables inland. Because you've got all sorts of roadblocks. There's a right-of-way, you've got people who are breaking their cables, you need to pay this and pay that, you know, you've got all sorts of rent seeking. Okay? Because you don't have the rent seekers between Portugal and Lagos. But once you get to Lagos, the rent seekers begin to appear. You know? And this is the challenge. So that ultimately, and I'm sure this is, I talk about the Nigeria story, but I'm sure this is familiar to many African countries. You've got people who, because of their own short-term interests, stop. I mean, there should be no problems with bandwidth in Nigeria. With the MTN cable and the main one cable, we shouldn't have any problems with telecoms bandwidth. We should have fixed all the problems with telecoms infrastructure. When you talk to telecoms companies, and the stories they tell you are horrendous of what it takes to just move cable inland into Lagos. And we need to keep working on that, breaking those barriers. And one of the things we do, for example, with the Ministry of Communications, is working on the infrastructure of the old Nigerian postal services. They've got branches all over the country. We have a program that's called Digital Inclusion, Financial Inclusion, trying to get telecoms all the way to rural areas and then leverage off that for financial inclusion and also for development. So for example, we use mobile phones as in Kenya to deliver subsidies for fertilizer. We would like to use mobile phones to deliver maternal health care. Okay, now you can't do that until you actually get digital inclusion into the rural areas and put mobile phones in the hands of women and teach them how to use that. So there's a combined, there are great opportunities that are opened up, but again, we've got to remove all the roadblocks that we have on the way.
We'll take another 3 questions, gentlemen.
Yes, my name is Chief Bobbitt. I had a question for you regarding, it's a difficult question. The current situation in Nigeria, institution, I just left Africa, and one issue that comes up in a lot of international forums in the case of Nigeria is the issue of this Boko Haram. And what impact, if you could measure it, does it have on the broader economy looking forward in terms of growth?
Not on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Okay.
It's an honor to meet you. Hopefully my question is much simpler. It's about the World Bank leadership nominations. Many of us Nigerians in the US naturally, by default, support our finance minister, not just because she's one of us, but because we actually believe she's a formidable candidate. But living here, we're probably removed from the impact in Nigeria having the finance minister leave right in the middle of all the reforms. And so what are your thoughts as to her candidacy?
Third question. Yes.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to us. I'm actually originally from Tanzania, so I was very happy when you mentioned my country there. Thank you for that. Big up to East Africa. My question is regionalization. So we have the East African community, there's regionalization there. SADC is another one, right? Nigeria has 167 million people, like you mentioned. But for other regions to compete, we have to join together, right? How are we integrating the process across Africa? In order to attract investment, obviously, sustain that investment, even own our own markets before we start thinking of competing with other people. So I think I'm going to stop there, and that's my question.
Okay, so I'll take this lead. I'll start from number 2. Now, I don't think there's any doubt now in anyone's mind that Ngozi is the best suited candidate for this job. Okay? I do not say she's the best person. I'm sure if you are going for the World Health Organization, Dr. Kim would be the best. And if you're doing, that's his field. And if you're going for an academic economic post, Dr. Ocampo would be the best. But if you're going for World Bank president, where you have an economist who's got World Bank experience, who's run finance in the developing economy, who's got diplomatic experience, I don't think anyone doubts that she is the best qualified for that job. Now, the question is, there are political issues, okay? And if there's one thing that we have done, it's to present a candidate. And this is not about being African, about being Nigerian, about being a woman. It's about a human being that on the basis of CV, hands down, is the clear favorite in terms of merit, if it is a merit-driven process. And we do have a commitment by G20 to have a merit-driven process. Now we wait for and see if the G20 would honor this commitment. And that's all. We don't have the votes. We're simply asking, I was at a forum where I'd be very surprised. I've been told that if the Americans don't get their candidate, then the Congress is not going to give money to the World Bank if the World Bank decides to appoint a president based on merit. I don't know if that is true, but we'll wait and see. But the reality is, this is all politics. I think whatever happens, for me as a Nigerian, I'm proud to have a candidate that everybody recognizes is qualified for this job. And if she loses on